Okay, hello, good morning everybody. Today we have our morning session with two presentations, and we're going to begin with Abdullah Ridwan Gukbel, who is doing very interesting work we discovered yesterday at Tübingen, working with some very interesting fatwa collections. Also a topic that's very pertinent to our work today. He's going to present on constructing Salafi authority, legal discourses on churches in 14th and 15th century, Islamic thought. He's currently a PhD student at the University of Tübingen, where he's part of a larger research project that's looking at constructions of the other. And his work is focusing particularly on Christians. And so thank you very much, and we look forward to listening from you.
Yeah, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for organizing this such a wonderful conference. Before I begin, I want to introduce first myself. As Dr. Khan mentioned, that I am a PhD student at the Center for Islamic Theology at the University of Tübingen. And today I will share some of my primary sources I am using in my PhD. My overall project is the Christian-Muslim relations in Ottoman context, and more specifically about Ottoman scholars from the 16th century, and more specifically about Ibn Kemal, Shaykhul Islam Ibn Kemal, and his corpus in different languages, in such as Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian works. I'm looking at his own corpus, and especially to the references to Christianity. So today I will look at some primary sources related to one chapter of my dissertation, which is about reconstructing churches. There are lots of interesting treatises on church written by Muslim scholars, going back to the 14th century until the 16th and to the 17th and 18th century from different parts of the Muslim world. So today I will, the materials I will share today is mostly the treatises written by Egyptian scholars on churches. So the conference theme, the authority of silence, invites us to reflect on how the early generations of Muslims, collectively referred to as Salafi Salih, have been invoked, interpreted, and reimagined through Islamic intellectual history. While the Salaf are often represented as unified, silent transmitters of prophetic truth, the authority built upon their legacy is far from monolithic. In this presentation, I argue that Salafi authority was not a static framework, but rather a dynamic and interpretive construct continually reshaped by legal, theological, and socio-political priorities across different times and places. To explore this, I focus on a set of legal treatises written between the early 14th and the late 15th centuries, centered on a controversial and deeply symbolic question: is it legally permissible to rebuild a church under Muslim rule? In Mamluk Cairo, this question gave rise to a robust legal discourse, producing treatises by figures such as Ibn Rifa'ah, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Taqiyuddin as-Subki. These jurists engage not only with the Quran and prophetic tradition, but also with the legacies of early scholars whom they framed explicitly and implicitly as representatives of the Salaf. What makes this discourse especially intriguing is its diversity. Despite invoking the same legal schools, similar historical precedents and often the same foundational authorities, these jurists arrived at different conclusions. Their debates illuminate how reference to the Salaf functioned not as a citation of fixed rules, but as an open side of negotiation between the inherited tradition and contemporary exigency. In this presentation, I will also introduce a newly rediscovered late Mamluk treatise by Jalaluddin Suyuti entitled Bushra al-Abis fi Hukm al-Biya wa al-Duyur wal-Kanais. Though shorter in form, this work encompasses many of the legal and theological tensions of the period. Through these references to Shafi authorities such as Al-Mawardi and Al-Shirazi, Suyuti not only reaffirms but also subtly reinterprets the authority of the Salaf for his own time. My goal in this paper is to trace how these four scholars constructed legal authority through selective references to earlier generations, how silence and absence become tools for juridical presence, and what this tells us about the evolving role of the Salaf in post-classical Islamic legal thought. The figure of the Salaf occupies a paradoxical position in Islamic intellectual history. On one hand, they are invoked as an ultimate source of authority, embodying prophetic memory, pure understanding, and untainted religiosity. On the other hand, the actual words, writings, and positions of the most members of these early generations remain largely unknown or inaccessible. Their authority, therefore, is often built not on documented teachings, but on remembered silence, on what they did not say or did not need to say. So furthermore, the Salaf were widely referenced across the legal spectrum, as we shall see. Shafi scholars such as Ibn Rif'a, As-Subki, and As-Suyuti rudely appealed to earlier generations in their reasoning, not always to repeat them, but sometimes to critique them, or to offer new interpretations in their name. The Salaf thus emerged not as a fixed point of origin, but as a rhetorical space within which legal and theological debates are negotiated. This framework is particularly useful when analyzing polemical texts on interreligious issues, such as the construction and repair of churches, where scholars navigated inherited principles, political pressure, and public sentiment. In this context, Salaf appear not only as the juristic authorities, but as the symbols of moral clarity and communal identity. Their voice, constructed through citation and attribution, often bore the weight of political justification and social normativity. In what follows, I will examine how this symbolic authority was activated differently by four major scholars, each of whom, in confronting the same legal question, turned to the Salaf in different ways. Through their works, we gain a window into the discursive strategies by which silence was transformed into a guidance and history into normativity. So let me begin with the earliest and arguably most polemical of the treatises, Al-Nafa'is fi Hadm al-Kanais, authored by Ibn Rif'a. This work, a condensed version of an earlier fatwa, is not only a legal document, but also a reflection of the broader social and political anxieties in early 14th century Cairo. The text was written in the wake of rising public discontent with the visibility and affluence of non-Muslim communities in Mamluk capital, as regarded in the detail of the historian Al-Maqrizi. In this fatwa, Ibn Rifa outlines 5 legal arguments, each designed to support the demolition of Christian and Jewish places of worship in Cairo. His approach represents a radical departure from the earlier precedents, such as the Pact of Omar, which had long served as a normative framework for the regulating the states of non-Muslims and their regulations institutions under Islamic rule. The core of Ibn Rifa's arguments lies in a legal inversion rather than presuming the legitimacy of existing churches and synagogues. He argues that any such buildings in cities founded by Muslims, like Cairo, should be assumed to have been built after the Islamic conquest. In this reasoning, Christian and Jewish communities who claim otherwise must be treated as plaintiffs in a legal dispute bearing the full burden of proof. Moreover, he asserts that even if such communities succeeded in proving the antiquity of their buildings, those structures would only be allowed to remain if they were the subject of explicit agreements with Muslim conquerors. Crucially, he adds that any such agreements would have applied only to the original parties and would have expired over time. Finally, he insists that Christians must demonstrate they had not violated these hypothetical agreements in the intervening centuries. Through this tightly structured argument, Ibn Rifa seeks to delegitimize the very presence of non-Muslim worship places in Cairo. While his fatwa was not officially implemented, indeed, it was challenged by contemporary jurists such as Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, nonetheless played a key role in shaping public attitudes and enabling popular acts of destruction. This fatwa reflects a broader trend of a legal reasoning that used historical silence, specifically the lack of clear authorization of churches, as grounds for radical legal and social action. Although Ibn Rifa does not systematically cite early authorities by name, his strategy implicitly appeals to the authority of Salaf by framing his conclusions as a return to foundational Islamic principles, uncorrupted by later accommodatians. In this sense, his silence regarding specific Salafi references is itself a form of invocation, one that seeks to review an imagined orthodoxy by displaying centuries of legal tolerance. Following the controversial fatwa of Ibn Rifa, the discourse on church construction and religious minorities were further developed by one of the most polemical figures of the late medieval Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah. His treatise Mas'ala fil Kana'is, written by Ibn Taymiyyah, offers a robust defense of the closure and even demolition of churches in Muslim territories, particularly in Mamluk Egypt. Responding to an inquiry that questioned whether closing Coptic churches in Cairo was just, Ibn Taymiyyah categorically denies any injustice. He argues that the consensus, ijma, of the Salaf, including the companions, the followers, and early jurists from all 4 Sunni legal schools, was that churches in territories conquered by force, the Anwatan, could be lawfully demolished at the discretion of the Muslim ruler. In his view, Egypt clearly belonged to such territory. The only reason early Muslims allowed some churches to remain, he explains, was due to the pragmatic concerns. Christians lived in rural areas, away from the military camps, and not because of any principal toleration. What distinguishes Ibn Taymiyyah's argument is his strategic deployment of the Salaf. unlike Ibn Rifa, who implies the authority of the early generations through legal structure. Ibn Taymiyyah explicitly names the Salaf as the legal and moral foundation of his position. He invokes the example of Umar ibn al-Khattab and other righteous rulers who allegedly destroyed churches in line with the prophetic teachings, including the oft-cited hadith, there should not be two qiblas in the same land. For him, the Salaf are not merely part of the legal tradition, they are the tradition. In addition to this, Ibn Taymiyyah uses his deep knowledge of Egyptian history to undermine Christian claims. He rejects the idea that the churches in Cairo date back to the time of the Omar, arguing instead that the Fatimid regime's Ismaili orientation and disregard for the Sharia had allowed Christians to build new churches over the 200-year period. Thus, for him, these churches have no rightful claim to permanence and should not be protected. Moreover, he responds to related questions in the fatwa related to the earlier examples. He forbids protected people, Ahl al-Dhimma, from appealing to foreign Christian powers and warns Muslims against prioritizing political and economic expandence over religious integrity. In this treatise, Ibn Taymiyyah not only reinforced the precedent set by Ibn Rifa, but expands it by integrating a more detailed theological and historical argument. Although his position was not the universal accepted, Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwa became part of the wider Mamluk era literature that legitimate the marginalization of the Christians and the other non-Muslims. In this context, Salafi authority functioned not as a relic of the past, but as a vital and reactive force invoked to shape contemporary policy and religious identity. The third voice in our discussion is that the Taqiyuddin al-Subki, a towering figure of Shafi jurisprudence and the theology in Mamluk Cairo, his engagement with the question of the church, church repair came in response to a specific event. The dome of a church collapsed in Lebanon, and a council of Muslim jurists ruled that it could be rebuilt. As-Subki strongly disagreed with this judgment and penned a detailed response, titled Kashf al-Dasa'is fi Tarmim al-Kanais. Remarkably, he completed the main body of the text in just 4 days and followed it with a more structured version, Idahu Kashf al-Dasa'is fi Tarmim al-Kanais, within the same year. The Subki's treatise is structured into 4 thematic parts. He begins with the hadith reports and stipulations from the Pact of Omar, moves on to the legal status of religious buildings in conquered territories, surveys the positions of major legal schools, and ends with a direct critique of the fatwa issued by his Shafi colleagues, particularly that of his former teacher, Ibn Rifa. What is striking about Ibn as-Subki's argument is its internal complexity. On the one hand, he does not categorically prohibit the repair of churches. Rather, he maintains that while such actions might not be strictly forbidden, they should not be seen as legal permitted in a way that grants non-Muslims any enduring rights over their buildings. In doing so, Ibn as-Subki diverges from both the rigid demolitions logic of Ibn Rifa and the expansive historical consensus claimed by Ibn Taymiyyah. He does not invoke the Salaf as a unified or closed authority, but instead engages critically with earlier jurists, including his own predecessors, highlighting the interpretive multiplicity within the Shafi'i tradition itself. In his later work, إيضاح كشف الدسائس, As-Subki elaborates on his tension by dividing the argument into 5 chapters, and so on. In summary, Ibn As-Subki illustrates that invoking the Salaf or the legal tradition more broadly did not always yield uniform conclusions. His treatise stands as a sophisticated example of internal critique within the Islamic legal tradition, one that complicates our understanding of Salafi authority by exposing its interpretive fractures. The final figure in our inquiry is Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, a prolific polymath of the late Mamluk period. Those legal voices carried considerable influence in the post-classical Islamic world. His short yet striking treatise, Bushra al-Abis fi Hukm al-Biya wa Duyur wal-Kanais, presents a condensed but forceful restatement of classical positions on non-Muslim places of worship. Written in response to increasing public debate and confusion regarding whether Christians and Jews should be allowed to maintain or rebuild their religious structures under Muslim rule, Bushra al-Abis opens with a tone of divine praise and civilizational trumpet. The As-Suyuti emphasized that Muslim mosques are devoutly favored over biya and kanais, that is synagogues and churches, and that rebuilding or expanding such structures should be restricted in accordance with the established tradition. Notably, while the term of Salaf does not appear explicitly, As-Suyuti frames his entire argument by referencing early Shafi authorities such as Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi and al-Mawardi. He draws from At-Tanbih and Al-Hawi al-Kabir to assert that non-Muslims must not build or elevate religious buildings in Muslim lands. And if their structure are destroyed, they may not rebuild except perhaps by permission and only in their original form. Even when he considers that minor repairs may be tolerated, expansion or adornment is to be forbidden, lest it slightly threat or pride in non-Muslim faith. Suyuti goes further, asserting that it is a duty for Muslim authorities to regularly inspect Christian and Jewish quarters to ensure no new construction occurs. He even suggests that the presence of visible, ornate churches in a sign of rulers' weak faith, a shameful reversal of proper Muslim dominance. So in this treatise, Suyuti, what sets Bushra al-Abis apart is its didactic clarity, while Ibn Rifa constructed a dance of the dance legal architecture and Subki engage in an intra-madhab critique. Suyuti simplifies and reaffirms inherited doctrines for a wider audience, offering a snapshot of legal orthodoxy as it was taught and practiced in waning years of Mamluk Sultanate. And in short, Bushra al-Abis offers a window into how late medieval jurists selectively drew on earlier authorities, invoking the voice of the Salaf through the text and rulings of the Shafi'i giants to enforce a theological vision of Islam's supremacy in public space. It demonstrates that the Salafi authority, even when unspoken, remained a structuring force in post-classical Islamic discourse. Having examined the individual positions of Ibn Rifa, Ibn Taymiyyah, As-Subki, and As-Suyuti, we can now turn to a comparative analysis to assess how each scholar invoked or refrained from invoking Salafi authority, and what this tells us about the flexibility and the construction of that authority across time. All four jurists share a fundamental commitment to upholding Islamic dominance in public space, and all accept the general legal principle that non-Muslims should not build new places of worship under Muslim rule. Yet their strategies for legitimizing this stance, especially through the reference to earlier authorities, differ in tone, scope, and legal methodology. Ibn Rifa, for instance, represents an early example of radical legal reasoning that departs from the more permissive traditions associated with the Pact of Omar. His position is grounded less in textual citation than in a structure presumption that all churches built in Cairo must have postdated the Islamic conquest and are thus illicit. His authority is rooted in reinterpretation of historical silence, not in a direct appeal to the Salaf by name, but through the claim of returning to uncorrupted legal principles. And Ibn Taymiyyah, by contrast, explicitly names the Salaf. He constructs a wide-ranging consensus across the generations, drawing from the companions to the early jurists and the four Sunni schools to justify a more aggressive policy of demolition. In doing so, he deploys Salafi authority rhetorically and polemically, combining scriptural citation, historical analysis, and legal theory into a cohesive defense of Islamic rule. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the Salaf are a living tradition invoked not only to justify past norms, but to actively reshape present policies. As-Subki, writing a new decades later, adopts a different approach, while he too upholds a restrictive position toward non-Muslim worship. His method is more introspective. He critiques his own madhab, engages directly with the fellow Shafi scholars, and reinterprets earlier rulings without appealing to any fixed consensus. His reluctance to define repair of church as either clearly permissible or impermissible reflects his discomfort with doctrinal finality. In this sense, Subki's voice challenges the notion of a stable Salafi consensus and highlights the internal plurality of Sunni legal discourse. Finally, Suyuti marks a shift in tone and style. While he does not mention Salaf by name, his argument is constructed entirely through the legal canon of Shafi school, especially works by Al-Mawardi and Al-Shirazi. His treatises, his respective and declarative, aimed not at scholarly peers, but a broader administrative or pedagogical audience. He represents inherited doctrine as settled, even as he uses it to support aggressive policies of inspection and regulation. In Suyuti, we see the legal orthodoxy and silencing interpretive plurality. Taking together, these four treatises demonstrate that Salafi authority was not a fixed doctrinal set, but a dynamic construct, invoked, reframed, or even problematized according to the jurist's institutional position, historical context, and strategic aims. Their diverse engagements with the Salaf, sometimes explicit, sometimes silent, reveal that the authority of the early generations was less about replication than about representation. In conclusion, I have explored 4 key treatises written from the 14th and the late 15th centuries that address the legal status of non-Muslim places of worship in the Islamic world. These texts by Ibn Rifa, Ibn Taymiyyah, Subki, and Suyuti not only reflect legal reasoning on a highly sensitive topic, but also reveal how jurists across time invoked the legacy of the Salaf to justify, refine, or reconfigure their positions. What becomes evident is that the Salafi authority, authority of Salaf, far from being a uniform aesthetic concept, was dynamically constructed. It was adapted to new historical contexts, political tensions, and intellectual priorities. Ibn Rifa drew on implicit principles of early Islam to challenge the buoyant environment of Christian worship in Cairo. Ibn Taymiyyah expanded this with explicit reference to Salafi consensus and deepened it with historical polemic. As-Subki responded critically within his own legal school, raising methodological concerns about doctrinal overreach. And As-Suyuti, writing in a period of post-classical consolidation, reaffirmed inherited doctrine with clarity and urgency, yet without open citation of the Salaf themselves. These variations matter because they disrupt the assumption that the Salaf represent a monolithic or timeless voice within the Islamic legal tradition. On the contrary, each jurist selectively constructed the figure of Salaf to suit their argumentative needs. Sometimes the Salaf were postulated as a consensus, other times as a silence to be interpreted. Sometimes as an idealized past, and sometimes as a rhetorical device meant to signal continuity and authority. This insight not only nuances our understanding of post-classical Islamic law, but also opens up new questions for further study. How do later jurists continue to shape the authority of the Salaf in periods of theological and political transformation? How does this selective invocation relate to institutional power and regional context or sectarian identity? In this case of church construction and repair, the Salaf become not simply a source of legal rulings, but a contested symbol of Islamic identity and control. And their authority is shaped not by what they wrote, but by how later scholars imagined them and by how those imaginations shaped the legal, social, and architectural realities of non-Muslim life under Muslim rule. In closing, I hope to have shown that the Salaf were not only remembered through silence, but strategically voiced in a moments of legal uncertainty, and that their legacy, far from being fixed inheritance, was constitutionally reinterpreted to meet the evolving demands of Islamic governance and jurisprudence debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.